It was supposed to be a surprise. After years of predictable routines and growing distance, I wanted to reignite the spark in my marriage by coming home early with my husband James's favorite takeout and a bottle of wine. But the real surprise was what waited for me behind our bedroom door. There are moments in life that divide everything into before and after. When I saw James tangled in the sheets with my younger sister Olivia, and he had the audacity to laugh in my face and tell me I was too boring, that was my moment. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. What happened next would change all of our lives forever. I stood frozen in the doorway, my body unable to move though my mind was screaming. The takeout bags dropped from my hands, splashing sauce across our cream carpet, the one James had complained about me staining just last week. The irony wasn't lost on me, even in that devastating moment. James didn't scramble to cover himself or stammer apologies like you might expect. Instead, he leaned back against our headboard, the one we'd picked out together on our 5th anniversary, and let out a chuckle. An actual laugh, as if catching him with my sister was some minor inconvenience in his day. "Well," he said, his voice casual, as if commenting on the weather. "This is awkward timing." Olivia at least had the decency to look horrified, pulling the sheets up to her chin, her eyes wide with panic. My little sister, the one I'd helped raise after our mother died, the one whose college tuition I'd helped pay while working double shifts, the one who'd been staying with us temporarily for the past 3 months while she got back on her feet. "Sarah," she whispered. "I can explain." James cut her off with another laugh. "Explain what? That your sister is too boring in bed? Too boring in life?" He looked at me then, his eyes challenging, almost daring me to break down. "Come on, Sarah. You had to know this was coming. When was the last time you did anything spontaneous? Anything exciting? You're like living with a librarian, except the books would probably have more personality." The words cut deeper than any knife could have, not just because of their cruelty, but because of the tiny grain of truth buried within them. I had become predictable, comfortable, focused on building our future while he apparently focused on destroying it. "How long?" I asked, my voice surprisingly steady despite the earthquake happening inside me. Neither answered immediately. James looked at Olivia, as if leaving it up to her to decide how much truth to tell. 2 months, she finally said, unable to meet my eyes. 2 months. 60 days of betrayal under my own roof. Countless family dinners where they'd exchanged glances. I'd misinterpreted as sibling tolerance. Dozens of mornings when James had kissed me goodbye while holding the secrets of where his lips had been the night before. I should have screamed. I should have thrown things. I should have fallen apart right there on our bedroom floor. But something strange happened instead. A calm clarity washed over me, like stepping out of a fog I hadn't even realized I was lost in. "I see," I said quietly. James's expression changed then, a flicker of unease crossing his face. Perhaps he'd expected tears, hysteria, the drama that would cast him as the reasonable one dealing with an emotional wife. My composure seemed to unsettle him more than any outburst could have. "Look," he said, his tone softening into the one he used when trying to talk me into something. "Maybe this is for the best. We've been drifting apart for years, Sarah. You know it. I know it. We're different people now." Olivia remained silent, shame radiating from her in waves. Or perhaps it was fear, not of me, but of what happened next. She'd always been able to read me better than most. I pulled my phone from my pocket, my fingers moving with purpose before I'd even consciously formed a plan. The camera flash lit up the room briefly. "What are you doing?" James demanded, his casual demeanor evaporating instantly. "Evidence," I replied simply, "and making sure I remember this moment exactly as it is." "Delete that right now," he ordered, suddenly scrambling to cover himself, the power dynamic shifting visibly in the room. I took another photo, then calmly slid my phone back into my pocket. "You know," I said, my voice still unnervingly steady, "you're right about one thing, James. I have been boring, predictably loyal, predictably trustworthy, predictably believing that my husband and my sister were decent human beings." I smiled then, and something in my expression made both of them flinch. "But what I do next? That's not going to be boring at all." I turned to leave, but James's voice stopped me. "Don't be dramatic, Sarah. What exactly do you think you're going to do?" There was a nervous edge to his mockery now, the laugh that followed slightly forced. I looked back over my shoulder, meeting his eyes directly. "I'm going to show you just how unboring I can be." The confidence in my voice surprised even me. In that moment, something fundamental shifted inside me. The comfortable, predictable Sarah was gone, replaced by someone stronger, someone with nothing left to lose and everything to reclaim. So, I closed the bedroom door behind me. I heard Olivia's panicked whisper, "James, what is she going to do?" His response was too low to hear, but the uncertainty in his voice was clear. For the first time in our marriage, James couldn't predict my next move, and that terrified him more than any threat I could have made. I walked down our hallway past the framed photos of happier times, our wedding, family gatherings, vacations, now all tainted by the knowledge of betrayal. But instead of breaking down, I felt a strange sense of liberation. The life I thought I had was already gone. All that remained was deciding what would rise from its ashes. That was the moment everything changed. Not when I caught them, but when I chose how to respond. What I did next would redefine everything, not just for James and Olivia, but for me. And boring was the last thing it would be. Before that day, my life had been a carefully constructed picture of suburban contentment. At least that's what I told myself. James and I had been married for 8 years, having met during our senior year of college when we were paired for a group project. He was charming, ambitious, and could light up a room with his presence. I was studious, thoughtful, and preferred deeper conversations to small talk. Opposites attract, everyone said. We balanced each other out. We bought our 2-story colonial in a quiet neighborhood 4 years ago, with a garden I meticulously tended and a kitchen where I experimented with recipes James would praise but never finish. He worked as a sales director for a pharmaceutical company, all charisma and networking dinners, while I built a modest career as an environmental scientist at a local conservation nonprofit. My work wasn't glamorous, but it was meaningful. Even if James's eyes glazed over whenever I talked about wetland restoration or endangered species monitoring. "You need to learn to tell better stories, Sarah," he'd say. "Nobody wants to hear about soil samples at a dinner party." So I learned to stay quiet when his colleagues and their spouses came over, smiling and refilling wine glasses while James held court with his animated anecdotes. Our routine was predictable, but comfortable. James traveled for work 2 weeks out of the month, leaving me to my own devices, reading, hiking, or having quiet dinners with the few close friends I'd maintained. When he returned, we'd have what he called reconnection weekends that seemed to become shorter and less intimate as the years passed. "This is just what happens in marriage," my friend Diane told me over coffee one day when I hesitantly brought up the growing distance. "The passion fades, and you find other things to build your life around." I nodded as if I accepted this. But something inside me refused to believe that emotional disconnection was the inevitable price of commitment. Olivia had always been the wild card in our otherwise orderly life. 6 years younger than me, she was everything I wasn't: spontaneous, effortlessly stylish, and unencumbered by overthinking. After our mother died from cancer when Olivia was just 19, I became her de facto parent, helping her navigate college and early adulthood with as much guidance as she would accept. "You worry too much," she'd tell me, rolling her eyes when I expressed concern about her tendency to quit jobs on impulse or her revolving door of questionable boyfriends. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Not everyone wants the white picket fence life. When she showed up at our doorstep 3 months ago after her latest relationship imploded, leaving her temporarily homeless, I didn't hesitate to offer our guest room. James had been surprisingly supportive. "Family is family," he'd said, helping carry her numerous suitcases upstairs. "Stay as long as you need." I remembered how touched I'd been by his generosity, how I'd lain in bed that night thinking how lucky I was to have a husband who embraced my family as his own. The memory now turned my stomach. Looking back, there were signs, of course. There always are, glaring in hindsight but easily dismissed in the moment. James suggesting I take that weekend workshop in Chicago alone. "You've been wanting to go, and I can keep Olivia company." The sudden interest in cooking dinner when I worked late, something he'd never bothered with before. The inside jokes between them that stopped when I entered a room. The way Olivia started dressing nicer around the house, wearing makeup on ordinary, weak days. I attributed Olivia's renewed energy to finally moving on from her ex. I thought James's cheerful mood was because work was going well. I believed what I needed to believe to maintain the fiction that my life was proceeding according to plan. 2 weeks before I discovered them, I'd found one of James's dress shirts in the guest bathroom. When I mentioned it casually over breakfast, Olivia quickly said she'd borrowed it to wipe up a makeup spill. "Hope that's okay? I'll replace it." James had given her an unreadable look before nodding and changing the subject. That night, I'd lain awake beside James, a strange unease taking root. "Do you think Olivia seems different lately?" I asked. James kept his eyes on his phone. "Different? How?" "I don't know. Happier, maybe." "Do you think she's seeing someone?" He'd tensed slightly, another sign I'd missed. "Why would I know anything about your sister's love life?" "You're home with her more than I am lately. I just thought maybe she'd mentioned something." "Nope." He'd set his phone down then and turned to me with an intensity that had been missing for months. The sex that night had been passionate but different somehow. Less like reconnection and more like he was trying to prove something. Afterward, as he fell asleep, I felt more alone than ever. The following week, I'd made an appointment. With a marriage counselor? I hadn't told James yet, but I'd planned to bring it up over the special dinner I was preparing for the night I came home early. The irony wasn't lost on me, seeking help to save a marriage that was already shattered beyond repair. The night before everything fell apart, the three of us had watched a movie together in the living room. I sat on one end of the couch while James and Olivia took the love seat, maintaining a respectable distance between them that now seemed performative. They'd both laughed a little too hard at parts of the film I didn't find particularly funny, as if sharing a frequency I couldn't tune into. "You're so serious, Sarah," James had commented when I didn't join their laughter. "It's just a stupid comedy. You don't have to analyze everything." Olivia had given me a look that I misread as sympathy rather than guilt. That was the last normal evening of my life, sitting in my living room with my husband and sister, completely unaware that in less than 24 hours, these two people who I loved most in the world would reveal themselves as strangers. As I stood in our hallway after discovering them, those memories flashed through my mind with new context, like reading a familiar book and suddenly understanding it was actually a horror story all along. The life I thought I had, stable if imperfect, had been an illusion. The question now wasn't how to fix what was broken, but what to build in its place. And for the first time in years, that uncertainty felt like freedom. The signs had been there all along, like breadcrumbs leading to a truth I wasn't ready to see. It wasn't just the shirt in the guest bathroom or their shared laughter that excluded me. There were dozens of small moments, subtle shifts that my subconscious registered while my conscious mind created explanations to maintain my sense of security. 6 weeks before I caught them, James had started changing his habits. After 5 years of complaining about my health food, he suddenly developed an interest in the green smoothies I made every morning. He began using the home gym equipment that had gathered dust in our basement. His phone, once carelessly left on countertops or coffee tables, became a permanent extension of his hand, screen always angled away from me. New security protocols at work, he explained when I asked why he'd added a fingerprint lock to his previously open device. Corporate espionage concerns. It sounded plausible. His company dealt with proprietary medical information, so I didn't question it further. Around the same time, Olivia started finding reasons to touch James in casual, seemingly innocent ways. A hand on his shoulder, when looking at something on his laptop, passing dishes at dinner with fingers that lingered a moment too long. Once I entered the kitchen to find her teaching him some yoga pose, her hands adjusting his stance in ways that looked more intimate than instructional. They jumped apart when they saw me, but James just laughed. "Your sister's trying to fix my back problems," he said, stretching casually. "Apparently, I have the posture of a gargoyle." Olivia had smiled too brightly. "You should join us next time, Sarah. Family yoga session." I never was invited to any subsequent sessions. Then there were the whispered conversations that stopped when I approached. The first time it happened, I was coming downstairs late one evening after working in my home office. They were sitting close together on the couch, heads bent toward each other, Olivia nodding seriously at whatever James was saying. When my foot hit the creaky third step, they instantly created distance between them, and James loudly asked Olivia about some TV show they both watched. "What are you two conspiring about?" I'd asked lightly, trying to ignore the knot forming in my stomach. "Birthday plans," Olivia replied smoothly. "We were trying to figure out what to get you. Way to ruin the surprise." My birthday was 4 months away, but I accepted the explanation because the alternative was too painful to consider. The dynamic in our home shifted subtly but unmistakably. James started suggesting I take more time for myself, encouraging me to attend conferences I'd previously skipped, to meet friends for dinner, to join weekend hiking trips with my conservation colleagues. "You work so hard," he'd say, massaging my shoulders with just enough pressure to seem caring rather than eager to be rid of me. "You deserve some time away from this house. I worry you're getting burned out." His sudden concern for my well-being seemed genuine. I interpreted it as growth in our relationship rather than what it was, calculated efforts to create opportunities for my absence. Meanwhile, Olivia's presence in our home expanded to fill the spaces I vacated. She rearranged our spice rack to be more functional. She bought new throw pillows for our couch that James praised as really brightening up the place. She cooked elaborate meals on evenings when I worked late, leaving enough for me but somehow always managing to have eaten with James before I returned. "We got hungry," she'd shrug when I arrived home to find them finishing dessert together, wine glasses nearly empty. "There's plenty left for you, though." 3 weeks before I caught them, I came home unexpectedly during lunch to grab research files I'd forgotten. The house had a strange energy. Music I didn't recognize playing softly, the scent of unfamiliar cologne in the air. I called out but received no answer. Upstairs, I noticed the guest room door firmly shut, unusual for the middle of the day. I knocked gently. "Olivia, you in there?" After a pause that stretched just a beat too long, her voice came through, unnaturally high. "Yeah, just, changing. What are you doing home?" "Forgot some files. Everything okay?" "All good. Super good. Just tired? Taking a nap." I stood there for a moment, my hand still raised to knock again, when I heard what sounded like a closet door quietly closing inside the room. Something cold slid down my spine, but I walked away, telling myself Olivia deserved privacy in her temporary home. When I mentioned the incident to James that evening, his reaction was too forceful to be natural. "Why would you think something's wrong? She said she was napping. Why are you being so suspicious?" His defensiveness triggered something in me. "I'm not being suspicious. I just thought she sounded strange." He softened then, realizing his mistake. "Sorry, just a stressful day at work. I'm sure she's fine. Maybe she had someone over and was embarrassed. You know how private she can be about dating." That explanation lodged in my mind, providing temporary comfort. Maybe Olivia had met someone new and wasn't ready to share. Maybe she was finally getting her life together. The alternative, that the someone in her room was my husband, remained safely buried beneath layers of denial. The most telling sign came 1 week before everything fell apart. I woke in the middle of the night to find James's side of the bed empty. The digital clock showed 2:37 a.m. I pulled on my robe and padded quietly downstairs, expecting to find him watching TV or raiding the refrigerator as he sometimes did during bouts of insomnia. The living room was dark. The kitchen was empty. A sliver of light shone beneath the guest room door, accompanied by the murmur of hushed voices. I stood in the hallway, my heart pounding so loudly I was certain they must hear it. My hand rose toward the door handle, then fell away. I returned to our bedroom and lay awake until dawn, creating increasingly elaborate explanations for why my husband would be in my sister's room in the middle of the night. When James slipped back into bed around 4 a.m., I pretended to be asleep. "You okay?" he whispered, perhaps noticing the tension in my shoulders. "Bad dream," I murmured, the irony of my words lost on him. The next morning, I scheduled an appointment with a therapist, convinced that my suspicions were manifestations of some unresolved trust issues from childhood, rather than instinctive recognition of betrayal happening under my own roof. That was the last warning I chose to ignore. The day that everything changed started normally enough. I woke up early, as usual, while James slept in. It was a Tuesday, and I had back-to-back meetings scheduled until 4 p.m. James had mentioned a client dinner that evening, so I expected another night of reheated leftovers and quiet solitude. At the office, I couldn't focus. My mind kept returning to the growing distance between James and me, to the strange atmosphere in our home since Olivia had arrived. During a morning break, I found myself searching online for signs your husband is cheating, and was disturbed by how many boxes I could mentally check off. My colleague noticed my distraction during our project review. "Sarah, you seem a million miles away today. Everything okay?" I manufactured a smile. "Just tired, having trouble sleeping lately." "Marriage stuff?" she asked sympathetically. "We'd had a few conversations about my concerns over drinks after work." "I'm probably overthinking things," I replied, deflecting as usual. But as the day progressed, an unfamiliar restlessness grew within me. During lunch, I stared at the calendar on my phone, at the client dinner James had added to our shared schedule. Something about it felt wrong. I called his office on impulse. "Hi, this is Sarah, James's wife. Just wanted to confirm the details for his dinner tonight so I can arrange transportation if needed," I told his assistant, my heart pounding at the deception. "Oh," she sounded confused. "James doesn't have anything on his calendar this evening. He actually cleared his schedule for the rest of the week. Something about a family matter?" The phone felt suddenly heavy in my hand. "Right, of course. I must have been looking at next week. Thanks for clarifying." I sat motionless at my desk after hanging up, a strange calm descending over me. It wasn't anxiety or even anger, just clarity, as if a fog had finally lifted. I sent an email to my team canceling my afternoon meetings due to a family emergency, then drove home with deliberate slowness, giving myself time to think. What exactly did I expect to find? What would I do if my worst suspicions were confirmed? I had no plan, just an overwhelming need to know the truth, whatever it might be. Our street looked the same as always. Neat houses, carefully maintained lawns, a perfect facade hiding whatever realities existed behind closed doors. James's car was in the driveway, so was Olivia's. Nothing unusual about that, except for the lie about his evening plans. I parked a few houses down, not entirely sure why I felt the need for stealth in approaching my own home. Perhaps some part of me already knew what awaited inside and was trying to delay the inevitable collision with truth. The front door key turned silently in the lock. I'd oiled the hinges just last weekend, another bit of home maintenance James never bothered with. The house was quiet, but not empty, quiet. There was an energy in the air, a subtle vibration that raised the hair on my arms. I slipped off my shoes, my stockinged feet silent on the hardwood floors. From the kitchen came the gentle clink of glasses, then low laughter. Olivia's musical, tones followed by the deeper rumble of James's response. "She'll never suspect a thing," I heard him say, his voice carrying clearly down the hallway. "Sarah's nothing, if not predictable. Home by 6, dinner by 7, in bed with a book by 9. I could set my watch by her routine." "That's not fair," Olivia responded, but her protest sounded half-hearted. "She's just structured." "Boring," James corrected her. "The word you're looking for is boring. When was the last time she did anything spontaneous? Anything exciting?" "This feels wrong, talking about her like this," Olivia said. But there was a giggle in her voice that belied any real discomfort. "What feels wrong is pretending I'm still in love with someone who's turned into my roommate," James replied, his tone hardening. "Sarah and I haven't really connected in years. You know that. We're just going through the motions." Their voices faded as they moved out of the kitchen. I stood frozen in the entryway, their words seeping into me like poison. Was that how he saw me? Boring, predictable, unworthy of love? The familiar urge to make excuses for him, "he's just venting, he doesn't mean it," was quickly overcome by a cold wave of understanding. The man I'd built my life around didn't respect me, let alone love me. I should have confronted them. Then, in the kitchen, a different woman might have. Instead, I followed the sound of their voices as they moved through the house, up the stairs, toward our bedroom. Something in me needed to see it, needed the irrefutable evidence that would make denial impossible. The hallway felt miles long, each step taking me closer to the end of the life I'd known. I heard music now, something low and jazzy that James had always said was too pretentious when I played it. More laughter, a squeal from Olivia, the sound of something, or someone, falling onto a bed. I paused outside our bedroom door, which was partially open. Enough to hear, enough to glimpse, but not enough to be seen. My body felt disconnected from my mind, as if I were watching myself in a movie, knowing what the character would find but powerless to stop her from looking. Through the gap in the door, I saw them. James was pouring champagne, the expensive kind we saved for special occasions, into flutes on our bedside table. Olivia was sprawled across our bed, her blouse half unbuttoned, her hair fanned out across my pillow. She reached for him, and he set down the bottle to join her, their lips meeting with the practiced ease of lovers well acquainted with each other's bodies. I must have made a sound, a gasp, a step, something that betrayed my presence, because suddenly James looked up directly at the doorway where I stood. Our eyes met, and for a fraction of a second, I saw surprise and perhaps even shame flash across his face. But then, as Olivia followed his gaze and spotted me, something shifted in his expression. He didn't jump up. He didn't scramble to explain. Instead, his face settled into something between a smirk and a smile. And then he did the unthinkable. He laughed, a short, dismissive chuckle that said more than any confession could have. It wasn't the nervous laughter of someone caught, but the confident amusement of someone who didn't fear consequences. "Well," he said, sitting up leisurely, "this is awkward timing." I thought you had meetings all afternoon. It wasn't the betrayal itself that broke something fundamental inside me. It was the laugh, the utter lack of remorse, the realization that I'd given 8 years of my life to someone who could look me in the eyes at my moment of greatest pain and find it amusing. And that's when I knew exactly what I needed to do next. I pushed the door fully open and stepped into the room, my body moving on autopilot while my mind raced. Olivia scrambled to button her blouse, her face pale with shock, but James remained relaxed, leaning against our headboard as if he were the wronged party interrupted during a normal activity. "Sarah?" Olivia stammered. "This isn't... we weren't..." "Save it," I said, my voice eerily calm even to my own ears. "I think what you were doing is perfectly clear." James sighed dramatically. "Look, this was bound to happen eventually. We might as well have an adult conversation about it." "An adult conversation," I repeated, the words tasting bitter. "About you sleeping with my sister in our bed?" "It's not like we planned this," he said, gesturing between himself and Olivia. "These things just happen." "Things don't just happen." "James, people make choices." I looked directly at Olivia, who seemed to shrink under my gaze. "Both of you made choices. Repeatedly." Olivia's eyes filled with tears. "I'm so sorry, Sarah. I never meant to hurt you." "Yet here we are," I replied coldly. James stood up then, straightening his shirt with infuriating casualness. "Let's not be melodramatic. Marriages evolve, people change. You and I haven't really been connecting for years. And your solution was to connect with my sister instead of talking to me." He had the audacity to shrug. "Olivia gets me in a way you stopped trying to a long time ago." "Gets you?" I laughed, but there was no humor in it. "What exactly is there?" "To get, James? The lying? The sneaking around? The complete disregard for anyone but yourself?" His expression hardened. "This is exactly what I'm talking about. The judgment, the self-righteousness. When was the last time you looked at yourself? Sarah? Really looked? You've become this uptight, predictable woman who's more interested in her plants and her books than in her husband." Each word hit like a physical blow, but I refused to show it. "So your affair is my fault? Because I'm boring?" I didn't say. "It was your fault, but yes, you're boring, Sarah. Painfully, mind-numbingly boring." He stepped closer, his voice gaining momentum. "Do you know what it's like living with someone who schedules spontaneity? Who turns passion into a chore that needs to be efficiently completed? Who makes me feel like I'm failing some invisible test every single day?" I felt something shift inside me, a lifetime of accommodating and apologizing giving way to rage so pure it was almost beautiful. "You want to talk about failure?" I asked quietly. "Let's talk about a man who isn't brave enough to either work on his marriage or end it honorably, who instead sneaks around with his wife's sister because it's easier than having an honest conversation. That's not just failure, James. That's cowardice." His face flushed with anger. "Don't you dare call me a coward." "What would you call it? Because from where I'm standing, you took every easy path available. So easy to blame me for your unhappiness. So easy to pursue someone who was living in our home. So easy to lie and cheat rather than face a difficult truth." Olivia had pulled her knees to her chest, watching our exchange with wide eyes. "Maybe I should go," she whispered. "No," James snapped. "You don't have to go anywhere. This is my house, too." "A house you've turned into a mockery," I said. "How long has this been going on? And don't lie to me. I deserve at least that much respect." They exchanged glances, having one of their silent communications that now made sickening sense. 3 months, James finally admitted, since Olivia moved in. The timeline hit me with fresh impact. 3 months? You mean the entire time she's been here? You invited my homeless sister into our home so you could sleep with her? It wasn't like that, Olivia interjected. It just happened. One night when you were at that conference in Denver. The conference you both encouraged me to attend? I said, the pieces clicking into place. The one where you said I shouldn't miss the opportunity, that I'd regret not going. You were setting me up. James at least had the decency to look uncomfortable with this direct accusation. We didn't plan it, he insisted. But yes, it started that weekend. I pulled my phone from my pocket and began to record. What are you doing? James demanded, suddenly alert. Documenting, I replied simply. Since we're having such an honest, adult conversation, I want to make sure I remember it correctly. Turn that off, he ordered, reaching for the phone. I stepped back. Why? Embarrassed to have your words recorded? Worried about who might hear them? This is private, he hissed. Like my marriage was supposed to be? Like my relationship with my sister? You made this a public spectacle the moment you decided to betray me under my own roof. Olivia was crying now, silent tears streaming down her face. Please, Sarah, we can work this out. Work what out exactly? I asked, turning my camera toward her. How do you suggest we work out the fact that you've been sleeping with my husband? That you looked me in the eye day after day while betraying me in the most fundamental way possible? Please, enlighten me. You're being cruel, James said, trying to position himself as the reasonable one. I'm being cruel? The laugh that escaped me was unfamiliar, almost wild. That's rich coming from the man who just called his wife boring to her face after she caught him in bed with her sister. This is exactly what I'm talking about, he countered, his voice rising. Everything is so black and white with you. People make mistakes, Sarah. Adults recognize that and find a way forward. A way forward, I repeated. And what does that look like in your mind? Do we all live here together? Take turns with you? Or were you planning to leave me for her once you'd secured your comfortable exit? He didn't answer, which was answer enough. You know what I find interesting? I continued, a strange calm settling over me. You claim I'm boring and predictable, yet you're shocked to find me here, doing something unpredictable. You claim to want excitement, but when confronted with the consequences of your actions, you want everything to proceed in a controlled, reasonable manner. I turned to Olivia. And you, the sister I helped raise, the one I've bailed out of every bad situation? Was this your plan all along when you asked to stay with us? Or was I just collateral damage in your pursuit of whatever you think James can offer you? I never meant for this to happen, she whispered, unable to meet my eyes. And yet you let it happen. Night after night. In my home. James moved toward me, his expression shifting to the placating one he used when trying to manage a difficult situation. Sarah, we're all upset right now. Let's take a break, calm down, and discuss this later like rational people. The condescension in his tone was the final straw. I stopped recording and appeared to put my phone away. But instead, I quickly sent the video to 3 people, my best friend, my lawyer, and James's mother, who had always treated me like a daughter. You want rational? I said, looking directly into his eyes. I just sent this conversation to your mother, my lawyer, and Diane. How's that for boring and predictable? The color drained from his face. You what? I told you things were about to get interesting. And for the first time that day, I smiled. The shift in James's expression was immediate and profound. The smug confidence evaporated, replaced by panic as he lunged for his phone on the nightstand. You can't be serious, he sputtered, frantically scrolling through his contacts. My mother? What the hell were you thinking? I was thinking it's time for some honesty, I replied, a strange calm settling over me. Isn't that what you wanted? For me to be less predictable, more spontaneous? Olivia had curled into herself at the edge of the bed, her face ashen. Sarah, please tell me you didn't really send that to people. Check your phones, I said simply. The notifications should be rolling in any minute now. As if on cue, James's phone began to ring in his hand. His mother's name flashed on the screen, and he stared at it in horror. He declined the call, only for it to immediately ring again. "You've ruined everything," he hissed at me, his composure completely shattered. "I ruined everything?" I laughed, the sound sharp and unfamiliar. "That's interesting logic from the man I just caught in bed with my sister." His phone continued to ring insistently. Each time he declined the call, it would start again seconds later. Meanwhile, Olivia's phone began chiming with incoming messages, likely from mutual friends who had already received the video from Diane. "You need to fix this," James demanded, gesturing wildly with his phone. "Call them back. Tell them it was a misunderstanding, something." I shook my head slowly. "No, I don't think I will. You wanted the truth out there, James. You wanted to..." "Stop pretending." "Well, congratulations. No more pretending." The doorbell rang, making all three of us freeze. It had only been about 15 minutes since I'd sent the video, not enough time for anyone to physically arrive at our house. Unless... "Expecting someone?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. James and Olivia exchanged panicked glances. The doorbell rang again, more insistently this time. "I'll get it," I said, turning toward the door. "Sarah, wait," James called after me, scrambling to get his shoes on. "Don't..." But I was already heading downstairs, a newfound energy propelling me forward. Whatever awaited me at the door couldn't possibly make this day any worse. I opened the front door to find Lisa, James's younger sister, standing on our porch with a cake box in her hands. Her cheerful expression faltered when she saw my face. "Sarah? Are you okay? You look like I just caught my husband in bed with my sister?" I finished for her. "Funny you should mention that." Lisa's mouth fell open. "What?" Behind me, I heard James thundering down the stairs. "Lisa, what are you doing here?" His voice was unnaturally high, strained with panic. Lisa looked between us, confusion evident on her face. "It's Mom's birthday dinner? At your house? You invited the whole family weeks ago." Her voice trailed off as understanding dawned. "You forgot, didn't you?" The absurdity of the situation hit me like a physical blow. In the midst of their affair, James had completely forgotten the family birthday dinner he'd organized for his mother, the very woman I'd just sent the video of our confrontation to. A laugh bubbled up from somewhere deep inside me, uncontrollable and borderline hysterical. "Oh, this is perfect," I gasped between fits of laughter. "Absolutely perfect." James stood frozen on the staircase, Olivia hovering behind him, both looking like deer caught in headlights. Lisa set the cake down on the entryway table and crossed her arms. "Would someone please tell me what's going on?" As if in answer, the sound of multiple car doors slamming came from outside. I stepped onto the porch to see James's parents, his older brother with his wife, and his teenage niece all walking up our driveway, carrying dishes and gift bags. "The gang's all here," I said, my voice dripping with false cheerfulness. "Please, everyone come in. We're having quite the family gathering today." James rushed forward, trying to block the doorway. "Mom, Dad, this isn't a good time. We need to reschedule." His mother, Eleanor, a formidable woman in her 60s with the same piercing blue eyes as her son, looked at him with an expression I couldn't quite read. Had she seen the video yet? Or was her phone still in her purse, the notification unread? "Nonsense," she said firmly, brushing past him into the house. "I've been looking forward to this all week. Sarah, dear, are you all right? You look upset." Before I could answer, Eleanor's phone chimed loudly from her handbag. She paused to retrieve it, scanning the notification with a frown. "That's odd. There's a video message from you, Sarah, but the preview image looks concerning." The entire family had filed into our living room now, an audience gathered for the implosion of my marriage. James looked physically ill, his face pale and sweaty, as he watched his mother tap on her phone screen. The sound of my voice filled the room as Eleanor played the video at full volume. Everything is so black and white with you. People make mistakes, Sarah. Adults recognize that and find a way forward. A way forward, my recorded voice responded. And what does that look like in your mind? Do we all live here together? Take turns with you? Eleanor's expression transformed as understanding dawned. She looked up slowly, her gaze moving from me to James, and finally landing on Olivia, who had crept halfway down the stairs. James Daniel. Walker, Eleanor said, her voice quiet but carrying the weight of a shout. What have you done? The silence that followed was deafening. James's father, his brother, his sister-in-law, all stood frozen, trying to process what they were witnessing. Only his teenage niece seemed to immediately grasp the situation, her eyes widening as she looked between all the adults. I can explain, James started, though his tone suggested even he didn't believe there was an explanation that would suffice. I sincerely doubt that. Eleanor cut him off, her voice ice-cold. She turned to me, her expression softening. Sarah, my dear, I am so sorry. The simple kindness in her voice nearly broke me. After hours of shock and rage and strategic thinking, I suddenly felt the full weight of what had happened crash down on me. Tears sprang to my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. Not here, not now, not with an audience. Well, I said, drawing myself up to my full height. This isn't quite how I plan to spend the evening, but since you're all here, would anyone like some cake? It was the kind of bizarre, inappropriate comment that could only emerge from shock, but it broke the unbearable tension in the room. Lisa let out a startled laugh, quickly stifled behind her hand. James's brother Mike shook his head in disbelief, and Olivia, still halfway down the stairs, began to sob. Eleanor took charge of the situation with the efficiency of a military general. Mike, take your family and go to our house. We'll join you. Later. Lisa, go with them. Your father and I need to have a conversation with your brother. No one argued. Within minutes, the extended family had filed out, leaving only James, Olivia, Eleanor, James's father Robert, and me in a living room thick with tension. Robert had been silent until now, his weathered face set in stone as he processed what was happening. He finally spoke, his voice low and controlled. Olivia, I think you should pack your things and leave. Olivia glanced desperately at James, who stood with his head down, saying nothing. Abandoned by her co-conspirator, she nodded meekly and retreated upstairs. Sit down, James, Eleanor commanded, pointing to the couch. James obeyed without protest, a child again in the presence of his disappointed mother. I remained standing, unsure of my place in this family tribunal. Part of me wanted to flee, to find a quiet corner to fall apart in private. But another part, the new Sarah emerging from the wreckage of today, refused to be chased from my own home. You too, Sarah, Eleanor said gently. Unless you'd prefer not to be here for this. I'll stay, I said, choosing an armchair across from James rather than beside him on the couch where I would have automatically sat just this morning. Robert paced slowly before us, the retired judge in him evident in his measured movements. I want to understand how we got here, he said finally. Not the affair itself. I have no interest in those details. I mean the breakdown that led to this point. James opened his mouth, likely to launch into his boring wife defense, but Eleanor cut him off with a sharp gesture. Before you speak, James, I want you to think very carefully about what you're about to say. Very carefully. He closed his mouth, swallowing whatever excuse he'd prepared. The silence stretched until I realized they were waiting for me to speak first. I took a deep breath, trying to organize the thoughts swirling in my mind. How had we gotten here? When had the foundation begun to crack? We met in college, I began, the words coming slowly at first. Senior year, group project in environmental economics. James was charming, outgoing, everything I wasn't, He made me laugh, drew me out of my shell. I looked directly at him as I continued. I adored that about him. How easily he moved through the world, how he could make friends anywhere. James shifted uncomfortably under my gaze but didn't interrupt. The problems started gradually, maybe 3 years into our marriage. Small things at first, James working later, me taking on more responsibilities at the conservation nonprofit. We were both busy, both tired. The conversations got shorter, the silences longer. "Did you try counseling?" Eleanor asked. I nodded. "I suggested it last year. James said we didn't need some stranger telling us how to communicate. He promised we'd make more time for each other, have regular date nights. It lasted about 2 weeks. That's not fair," James finally spoke up. "You were just as busy as I was. Half those date nights, you were checking work emails under the table. Because you were on your phone, too," I shot back. "Because sitting across from someone who's already mentally elsewhere is excruciating. See? This is exactly what I mean. Everything is my fault in your version of events. Is that what you think this is about? Assigning blame for a difficult patch in our marriage?" I leaned forward, my voice tight with controlled emotion. "This isn't about who worked too much or who checked their phone at dinner, James. This is about you deciding that the appropriate response to marital problems was to sleep with my sister in our bed." Robert cleared his throat. "Let's back up. When did Olivia come to live with you?" 3 months ago, I said. "Her boyfriend kicked her out and she needed a place to stay. I didn't hesitate. She's my only family since our parents died." I turned to Eleanor and Robert, the full impact of what I'd lost hitting me anew. "You know I considered you my family too, right? After my parents were gone, you welcomed me so completely. James got annoyed sometimes with Sunday dinners and holiday obligations, but they meant everything to me." Eleanor reached over and squeezed my hand, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "And you are family, Sarah. That doesn't change because of—" She gestured vaguely toward James. "This." James made a frustrated sound. "Can we stop acting like I committed some unforgivable crime? Marriages end all the time. People grow apart. They develop feelings for other people." "Other people," Robert repeated, his voice dangerously quiet. "Not their wife's sister who is living under their roof because she has nowhere else to go." "I didn't plan for this to happen," James insisted. "And yet you made dozens of choices that led directly to it," I countered. "You chose to pursue her. You chose to lie to me. You chose to continue the affair for months." "What about Olivia's role in this?" Eleanor asked gently. "I'm not excusing James, believe me, but I'm trying to understand the full picture." I sighed, the complicated tangle of emotions regarding my sister impossible to unravel neatly. Olivia has always struggled. After our parents died, she went off the rails a bit, dropped out of college, moved between dead-end jobs and questionable relationships. I've spent years trying to help her find stability, often against her resistance. "She resented you," James interjected. "Your perfectionism, your need to fix everything, it suffocated her." "Did she tell you that while you were sleeping with her behind my back?" I asked sharply. "She told me a lot of things," he replied. "About how controlling you can be. How you've always made her feel inadequate. How—" "That's enough," Robert interrupted. "James, whatever issues exist between Sarah and Olivia, you exploited them for your own gratification. That's not just a betrayal of your marriage vows. It's a betrayal of basic human decency." James fell silent, the weight of his father's disapproval finally seeming to penetrate his defenses. From upstairs came the sound of drawers opening and closing, Olivia packing her belongings. I wondered where she would go, then realized I know. Longer cared. The sister I thought I knew, the one I'd protected and supported through every crisis, had ceased to exist the moment she became intimate with my husband. The most painful part, I said quietly, is that I never saw it coming. I noticed the distance between James and me, but I truly believed we were just in a rough patch, something we could work through with time and effort. I laughed bitterly. Meanwhile, the two people I trusted most were building their connection at my expense. Eleanor leaned forward. Sarah, I need to ask, what do you want to happen now? It was the question I'd been avoiding, even in the privacy of my own thoughts. What did I want? Reconciliation seemed impossible. The marriage I thought I had was a fiction. The future I'd planned was in ashes. But from those ashes, something new was emerging. A Sarah who wouldn't settle, who wouldn't accommodate betrayal, who wouldn't shrink herself to make others comfortable. I said slowly, finding the truth as I spoke it, to rebuild my life, without either of them in it. Eleanor nodded at my answer, her eyes reflecting a mixture of sadness and respect. I understand, and we'll support you however we can. James scoffed. Of course you will. Sarah's always been the perfect daughter you wished you had instead of Lisa. Don't you dare bring your sister into this, Robert warned, his patience visibly thinning. And if we've shown preference to Sarah over the years, perhaps it's because she's demonstrated qualities worthy of our respect, unlike what we're seeing from you right now. The sound of footsteps on the stairs announced Olivia's return. She appeared in the doorway, 2 large suitcases in hand, her face blotchy from crying. She looked around the room, clearly searching for an ally and finding none. I've called an Uber, she said quietly. It'll be here in 5 minutes. Where will you go? I asked, surprised to find I still cared enough to ask. She shrugged. A hotel for tonight. Maybe Marcy's after that if she'll have me. Marcy was a casual friend from her last job, someone she'd occasionally mentioned but whom I'd never met. An awkward silence fell over the room. In any other circumstance, I would have jumped in to rescue Olivia from discomfort, to smooth over the tension, to make everyone feel better. But that Sarah was gone, buried under the weight of betrayal. I am sorry, Olivia finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. I know it doesn't help or change anything, but I am. You're right, I replied evenly. It doesn't. She nodded, accepting this as her due. I'll wait outside for my ride. As she moved toward the door, James suddenly stood. This is ridiculous. Olivia, you don't have to leave like this. We can figure something out. The implication was clear in his tone, that somehow we could all reach some understanding where their relationship could continue despite the damage done. It was so delusional, so completely self-centered, that I couldn't help but laugh. Figure? Something out? I repeated incredulously. What exactly is there to figure out, James? The logistics of moving your girlfriend into a new apartment while you divorce your wife? The holiday schedule for splitting time with your parents between the woman you married and the woman you cheated with? Please, enlighten us with your plan. James's face flushed with anger. You're making this uglier than it needs to be. No, Eleanor interjected firmly. You did that the moment you decided to betray Sarah's trust in the worst possible way. If you're looking for sympathy or understanding from this family, you've severely miscalculated. Olivia's phone pinged with a notification. My ride is here, she said, clearly relieved to escape the tension. She hesitated, then looked directly at me. For what it's worth, you were always a better sister to me than I deserved. With that, she turned and walked out the front door, her suitcases bumping, down the porch steps behind her. Through the window, I watched as she climbed into a waiting car without looking back. James stared after her, his expression unreadable. Was he already regretting his choices, or simply calculating his next move? I realized with a start that I no longer knew this man I'd pledged my life to. Perhaps I never had. You should go too, James, I said quietly. Not forever. We have much to discuss regarding the division of our assets, but tonight, you need to leave." He turned to his parents, clearly expecting them to intervene on his behalf. "Mom, Dad, tell her she's being unreasonable. This is my house too." "Actually," Robert said, his lawyer's mind always attentive to details, "if I recall correctly, Sarah put down the entire down payment from her parents' life insurance, and she's been making half the mortgage payments despite earning significantly less than you. So, while legally it may be jointly owned, ethically—" "Are you serious right now?" James interrupted, his voice rising. "You're taking her side on everything?" Eleanor stood, her small frame somehow imposing as she faced her son. "James, you have two options tonight. You can leave willingly and stay at a hotel, or you can continue arguing and I will personally pack a bag for you. Either way, you will not be sleeping under this roof." The finality in her tone left no room for debate. James looked between his parents and me, the reality of his situation finally sinking in. He was alone in this, his affair with Olivia having cost him not just his marriage, but the unconditional support of his family. "Fine," he muttered eventually. "I'll get some things." As he stomped upstairs, Eleanor turned to me. "We'll stay with you tonight if you want, Sarah. You shouldn't be alone." The offer touched me deeply, but I shook my head. "Thank you, but I think I need some space to process everything, to figure out what comes next." Robert nodded in understanding. "We're just a phone call away, day or night." We sat in silence as James threw items into a duffel bag upstairs, the occasional thud or slam expressing his frustration. When he finally came down, he paused in the doorway, as if waiting for someone to stop him, to beg him to stay. No one did. "I'll call you tomorrow about arrangements," he said to me, his tone businesslike. "We should talk when everyone's calmer." "I'll have my lawyer contact you," I replied, surprised by the steadiness in my voice. "I think it's best if we don't speak directly for a while." He flinched at the mention of lawyers, the reality of divorce suddenly concrete. "Sarah, don't do anything rash. We should at least try to—" "Goodbye, James," I said firmly, turning away from him. After a moment's hesitation, he left, the door closing behind him with a quiet click that somehow felt more final than a slam would have. Eleanor and Robert embraced me then, a family hug that nearly broke my carefully maintained composure. "We meant what we said," Eleanor whispered. "You're still our family." After they left, promising to check in tomorrow, I walked slowly through the house that had suddenly become both foreign and mine alone. In the kitchen, the abandoned champagne glasses James and Olivia had been drinking from still sat on the counter. In the living room, family photos mocked me from the walls. Upstairs, our bed. I couldn't bring myself to enter that room yet. Instead, I curled up on the living room couch, wrapping myself in the throw blanket that had been a wedding gift from James's grandmother. The house settled around me, creaking, and sighing as if it too were adjusting to the seismic shift in its foundation. My phone buzzed repeatedly with messages from friends who had seen the video, expressions of shock, support, offers of places to stay. I answered none of them. Tomorrow would be time enough for explanations and plans. Tonight was for mourning what was lost and beginning to imagine what might come next. As the initial shock began to wear off, the first tears finally came. Not gentle drops, but gut-wrenching sobs that shook my entire body. I cried for the marriage I thought I had, for the sister I had loved, for the future I had planned, and for the woman I had been, trusting, accommodating, afraid to take up space. By dawn, I had no more tears left, only a cold, clear certainty. That woman was gone for good. The week after James and Olivia left was a blur of practical motions and emotional numbness. I moved through my days like a ghost in my own life, going to work, answering necessary emails, consulting with a divorce attorney, and fielding concerned calls from friends. On the surface, I was handling things with remarkable composure, Inside, I was hollow. Sleep became elusive. Each night, I'd lie on the couch, still unable to face the bedroom, staring at the ceiling until exhaustion briefly overtook my racing thoughts. I'd wake an hour or two later, the cycle beginning again. Food lost its taste. Music grated on my nerves. Books couldn't hold my attention. It was as if my senses had dulled in proportion to the sharpening of my pain. James made several attempts to contact me directly. I let each call go to voicemail, each message more carefully worded than the last, as he evolved from defensive to conciliatory. Sarah, we need to talk about practical arrangements. Sarah, I know you're hurt, but we should discuss this like adults. Sarah, I'm sorry for how things happened, but maybe this is for the best for both of us. Each message I deleted without response, directing all communication through my attorney as a shield against his manipulations. Olivia tried only once, a lengthy text message that I read with detached curiosity, as if studying a specimen of particularly transparent self-justification. I know you'll probably never forgive me, and I understand. I never meant for this to happen, but James and I connected in a way I can't explain. We both feel terrible about hurting you. I hope someday you can see that sometimes people just find each other at the wrong time, but for the right reasons. I'll always love you. You're my sister. Please don't shut me out forever. I took a screenshot for my therapist. Yes, I'd finally started seeing someone, and then blocked her number. On the 10th night after everything fell apart, the numbness finally cracked. I was sorting through a drawer of photos, separating my life into keep and discard piles, when I found a picture from my parents last Christmas. Mom was already thin from the cancer treatments, but smiling broadly with an arm around each of her daughters. Dad stood behind us, his hands on Mom's shoulders, the four of us a complete circle. We'll always have each other, Mom had said that day. Family is the one thing you can count on when everything else falls away. Something broke inside me then, a dam holding back all the emotions I'd been too shocked to fully process. I sank to the floor, the photo clutched to my chest, and screamed until my throat was raw. I screamed for my lost marriage, my betrayed trust, my shattered family, and the utter aloneness that now defined my existence. When the screaming subsided, something worse took its place. Doubt. Had James been right? Was I boring, predictable, too focused on stability to remember passion? Had I driven him away with my routines and sensible choices? Was there some fundamental flaw in me that made me unlovable in the long term? I drank an entire bottle of wine that night, something I'd never done before, and called my best friend Diane at 2 a.m. "What's wrong with me?" I sobbed into the phone. Why wasn't I enough? Diane, bless her, didn't offer platitudes or easy reassurances. "Nothing is wrong with you," she said firmly. "James didn't cheat because you're flawed. He cheated because he's weak and selfish. But maybe if I'd been more exciting, more adventurous—" "Stop," she interrupted. "That's his narrative, not yours. Don't let him rewrite your story." But the doubts had taken root, wrapping around my thoughts like vines, squeezing until I could barely breathe. I spent hours scrolling through old photos and messages, searching for signs I'd missed, clues to when James had stopped loving me, if he ever truly had. The next morning, hungover and exhausted, I called in sick to work for the first time in years. I couldn't face the sympathetic glances, the careful conversations, the effort of holding myself together for another day. Instead, I did something I'd never allowed myself before. I surrendered completely to grief. I pulled all the curtains closed, silenced my phone, and curled up on the floor of my home office, the one room that felt entirely mine. I cried until there were no tears left, then lay in silence as waves of anger, betrayal, shame, and loss washed over me. I didn't fight the feelings or try to rationalize them away. I just let them come, acknowledging each one as it passed through me. Somewhere in that dark cocoon of grief, a small voice emerged. Not the cruel one feeding my doubts, but something clearer, calmer. "Why are you blaming yourself for their choices?" it asked. "What would you tell a friend in your situation?" I would tell her it wasn't her fault. I would tell her she deserved better. I would tell her that being trustworthy and consistent aren't flaws. They're strengths that the right person would value. The realization didn't immediately heal the wound, but it created the first tiny crack in the foundation of shame I'd been building. For the first time since finding James and Olivia together, I considered the possibility that I wasn't the one who needed to change. As evening fell, I finally showered, washing away dried tears and some of the heaviness I'd been carrying. I ordered food, actually feeling hungry for the first time in days. And while waiting for delivery, I impulsively rearranged the furniture in the living room, shifting the couch to face the window instead of the TV. It was a small change, insignificant, in the grand scheme of things, but it was mine. A choice made solely for myself, not to accommodate James's preferences or to maintain domestic harmony. For years, I'd positioned the room around the television because James liked to watch sports on weekends. Now I could arrange my home however I wanted. The realization landed like a revelation. I was free. Devastated, yes. Wounded, certainly. But also, unexpectedly, free. I ate my dinner by the window, watching as the last light faded from the sky, thinking about who I might become now that I was no longer defined by my roles as wife and sister. All the energy I'd poured into maintaining those relationships, into smoothing rough edges and bridging gaps. What might I accomplish if I redirected it toward myself? Later that night, I finally entered the bedroom. The sheets had long since been changed, the space cleaned of any physical reminder of their betrayal, but the emotional residue remained. I stood in the doorway, surveying the room that had been the center of so much pain. Then, deliberately, I crossed to James's side of the bed, opened the drawer of his nightstand, and emptied its contents into a box labeled James in bold black marker. I did the same with his dresser drawers, his side of the closet, his items from the bathroom. Every trace of him, boxed and labeled, ready for removal. When I finally lay down to sleep, in the center of my bed, not the side I'd been trained to, occupy, I felt something unexpected alongside the sadness, curiosity about what tomorrow might bring. It wasn't happiness or healing, not yet. But it was a beginning. 3 weeks after discovering James and Olivia's betrayal, I stood in the driveway watching as a moving company loaded the last of his belongings into their truck. James had wanted to come himself to collect his things, but my lawyer had advised against it, suggesting a third-party service instead. For once, James hadn't argued. "That's everything on the inventory list, ma'am," the foreman said, handing me a clipboard to sign. "Do you want to do a final check before we go?" I shook my head. "I'm sure it's fine." In truth, I didn't care if they'd missed something. Whatever remained could be donated or discarded. I wanted no loose threads connecting me to my past. The truck pulled away. I felt a weight lift. Not the whole burden I'd been carrying, but a significant portion of it. My home was now truly mine alone. I'd relocated to the guest bedroom, unable to reclaim the master suite that still held echoes of betrayal, but I had plans to renovate both rooms, to create spaces that reflected only my taste, my preferences. Back inside, I retrieved the notepad where I'd been compiling what I called my revolution list, changes both practical and personal that I wanted to make in my new life. Some items were trivial. Try that spicy Thai place James always vetoed. Others were more substantial. Consider career shift to environmental law. Each entry represented a step toward reclaiming myself from the ashes of my marriage. Today, I was tackling item number 12. Reach out to Eleanor and Robert. James's parents had respected my request for space, sending only occasional text messages to check in without pressuring me to respond. Their kindness in the aftermath of discovery had been a lifeline, but maintaining a relationship with them felt complicated. They were reminders of a family I thought I'd belong to forever, of holidays and traditions now forever altered. Yet they were also the closest thing to parents I'd had since losing my own. Could I preserve that connection without reopening wounds? I wasn't sure, but I wanted to try. I dialed Eleanor's number before I could overthink it. "Sarah?" Her voice was warm with surprise. "It's wonderful to hear from you." "Hi, Eleanor. I hope I'm not interrupting anything." "Not at all. We were just having lunch on the patio. How are you doing, dear?" The simple question, asked with such genuine concern, nearly undid me. "I'm managing," I said, finding honesty easier than false positivity. "Some days are better than others." "That's all anyone could expect," she replied. "Healing isn't linear, you know. It's more like learning to dance with a new partner. Sometimes you step forward, sometimes back, sometimes you trip entirely, but eventually the steps become more natural." I smiled at the metaphor. "That's a lovely way to put it." "Would you like to come over for dinner sometime this week?" she asked. "No pressure, and certainly no talk of James unless you want to. Just family dinner." Family dinner. The words caught in my throat. "I'd like that," I managed. "Very much." We set a date for Friday, and after hanging up, I checked "reach out to Eleanor and Robert" off my list with a sense of accomplishment that seemed disproportionate to the simple act of making a phone call. But that was how recovery worked, I was learning. Celebrating small victories, acknowledging each step forward. The next item on my list was more daunting. Decide about the job. Offer. 2 weeks earlier, out of the blue, I'd received a call from Martin Gregory, the director of a prominent environmental advocacy organization in the city. One of my research papers on wetland conservation had crossed his desk, and he was impressed, enough to offer me a position heading their new restoration initiative. The role came with a substantial salary increase, more responsibility, and the chance to make a real impact on policy, everything I'd wanted professionally. Under normal circumstances, I would have been ecstatic, but the job would require longer hours, occasional travel, and a level of public visibility I wasn't sure I was ready for in my current emotional state. I'd asked for time to consider the offer, and Martin had generously given me until the end of the week to decide. The old Sarah, the one who had shrunk herself to accommodate James's comfort, would have declined immediately, citing the disruption to her home life. But that Sarah was gone. The question now was, what did the new Sarah want? I made myself a cup of tea and carried it out to the backyard, settling into the Adirondack chair that faced my small garden. The roses I'd planted last spring were blooming, their vibrant reds and pinks defying the chaos that had engulfed their caretaker. Life continued to unfold according to its own rhythms, regardless of human drama. As I sat there, letting the sun warm my face, I thought about James's parting accusation, that I was boring, predictable, afraid of change. Had there been truth in his cruel words? Not in the way he meant them, as justification for his betrayal, but as an observation about how I'd been living my life. I had chosen stability, yes. After losing both parents in my early 20s, security had become my North Star. I'd shaped my life around avoiding further loss, further upheaval. I'd chosen a dependable career path instead of pursuing my more ambitious environmental law dreams. I'd married a man who seemed solid and established, rather than one who challenged or excited me. I'd cultivated a peaceful home life, avoiding conflict at all costs. But stability, I was beginning to understand, wasn't the same as stagnation. One could be grounded without being buried. Predictability wasn't inherently negative. It could also mean being reliable, trustworthy, someone others could count on. These were qualities to be proud of, not ashamed of. The real question wasn't whether I should become more exciting to prove James wrong. It was whether I had been making choices based on my authentic desires or out of fear. The job offer represented more than a career opportunity. It was a chance to test this new understanding. Was I avoiding challenge because it truly wasn't right for me, or because I'd trained myself to shy away from anything that disrupted the careful equilibrium I'd constructed? I pulled out my phone and dialed Martin's number before I could second-guess myself. "Sarah," he answered warmly. "Have you had a chance to think about our offer?" "I have," I replied, surprising myself with the steadiness in my voice, "and I'd like to accept." As I spoke the words, a sense of rightness settled over me. This wasn't about proving anything to James or becoming someone I wasn't. It was about allowing myself the freedom to grow in directions I'd previously closed. "Off out of fear or habit. That's wonderful news," Martin said, genuine enthusiasm in his voice. "When can you start?" I looked at my revolution list, at the items still unchecked, at the journey still ahead. "How about 2 weeks? I have some personal renovations to complete first." "Personal renovations," he repeated, sounding amused. "I like that. 2 weeks it is. Welcome aboard, Sarah." As I hung up, I added a new item to my list. Buy something impractical and beautiful for my office. Not because I needed to be less boring, but because I wanted to surround myself with things that brought me joy. And that, I was discovering, was revolution enough. 6 months after the day that changed everything, I stood in the doorway of what had once been the master bedroom, surveying the transformation. Gone was the heavy oak furniture James had insisted on, replaced by a light maple platform bed and minimalist nightstands. The walls, once a neutral beige that wouldn't clash with anything, now glowed a soft sage green that reminded me of early spring. Hanging above the bed was a painting I'd purchased from a local artist, an abstract explosion of blues and purples that James would have dismissed as pretentious nonsense, but that filled me with inexplicable joy. This room, like every space in the house, had been reclaimed, reimagined, reborn, much like its owner. The divorce had been finalized with surprising efficiency. James, perhaps hoping to minimize his public embarrassment, hadn't contested any of my requests. The house was mine, along with a fair division of our other assets. I'd heard through Eleanor that he had moved to the West Coast for a fresh start, and that Olivia had followed him there shortly after. Whether they were still together was not information I sought or cared to know. My new position at the environmental advocacy organization had proven to be exactly the challenge I needed. The learning curve was steep, the hours sometimes grueling, but the work fed something in me that had been starving for years, a sense of purpose, of making tangible difference in the world. I delivered my first public testimony before the state legislature last month, my voice never wavering as I presented our data on watershed protection. "You were born for this," Martin had said afterward, his approval warming me in a way that had nothing to do with romance and everything to do with professional respect. Personal relationships had shifted too. Some friendships hadn't survived. The divorce, couples who had been our friends rather than mine, people who found divorce uncomfortable or contagious, but others had deepened in unexpected ways. Diane had become not just a friend but a confidant, showing up with wine and takeout on difficult anniversaries, celebrating small victories, never asking if I was ready to date again as so many others did. And Eleanor and Robert had kept their word, remaining steadfastly in my life despite the absence of their son. Sunday dinners at their home had become a cherished ritual, a reminder that family could be chosen rather than simply inherited or married into. There were still hard days, of course. Moments when a song or scent would ambush me with memories. Times when the betrayal felt fresh again, the wound reopened by some casual reminder. Holidays were particularly challenging, spaces where absence was felt most keenly. But increasingly, those moments were outnumbered by days of contentment, even joy. I was building something new from the ruins of what had been destroyed. Not a replica of my former life, but something more authentically mine. Something that didn't require shrinking or compromising or constant maintenance of fragile peace. Something that, for the first time in years, felt like freedom. 1 year to the day after I caught James and Olivia together, I stood in my kitchen preparing dinner. Not for myself, though solo meals had become opportunities for culinary experimentation rather than lonely chores, but for a small gathering of the people who had helped me rebuild. Diane and her husband, Martin and his partner, Eleanor and Robert, and 2 new friends from my advocacy work. As I chopped vegetables for the salad, I realized I hadn't thought about the significance of the date until that moment. The anniversary had arrived without the weight of dread I'd anticipated. It was just another day, the past no longer defining my present. The doorbell rang, and as I welcomed my guests, accepting hugs and wine bottles and compliments on my newly renovated home, I felt a profound sense of rightness. This was my life now. Not a consolation prize or a backup plan, but a genuine expression of who I'd become. After dinner, as conversation flowed easily around my dining table, the one I'd chosen myself, with no one else's preferences to consider, Eleanor pulled me aside. "I have something for you," she said, pressing a small wrapped package into my hands. An anniversary gift of sorts. Inside was a delicate silver pendant, a phoenix rising from flames, its wings outstretched. "It reminded me of you," she said, simply. Later, after everyone had gone, I sat on my back porch, the pendant cool against my skin, reflecting on the journey of the past year. The woman James had dismissed as boring had testified before legislators, led a successful campaign to protect endangered wetlands, renovated a house, and built a community of people who valued her exactly as she was. The irony wasn't lost on me. In trying to destroy me, James and Olivia had inadvertently set me free. Their betrayal had forced me to question everything, not just my marriage, but my patterns, my choices, my very identity. In the painful dismantling of my former life, I'd discovered parts of myself that had been dormant for years. Would I choose to experience that pain again, knowing where it would lead? Perhaps not, but I could acknowledge now that the breakdown had been necessary for the breakthrough that followed. The most profound lesson wasn't about James or Olivia or even betrayal itself. It was about the danger of building a life around someone else's definition of happiness, about the quiet courage required to stand in your truth, even when that truth is inconvenient or painful. About the difference between compromise that honors both people and sacrifice that slowly erodes one person's spirit. I thought back to that moment in the bedroom doorway, when James had laughed in my face and called me boring. At the time, his words had cut deeper than any knife. Now, they seemed tragically small. The desperate justification of a man too weak to face his own failings honestly. "You're too boring," he'd said, as if that explained or excused his betrayal. What I'd done next wasn't about proving him wrong. It wasn't about becoming more exciting or interesting to anyone else. It was about reclaiming my right to define myself, to build a life that reflected my values and desires, and there was nothing boring about that. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.